And we're live. Hello, everyone. My name is Rira, and on behalf of Vroman's Bookstore, I'd like to welcome you all to our virtual event with Charles Rosenberg and Kenney. Before we begin, I do have some quick guidelines for y'all. This event includes an audience Q&A. To submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the very bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, just vote for it, and the question will make its way to the top of the list. We also have a poll going on asking folks if they've already read the book, so we can see if we could spoil a few things about the book. So feel free to answer that poll. And we have more virtual events scheduled for the upcoming weeks. Our next one is scheduled for Tuesday, September 8th with Anne Shen, the author of Nevertheless, She Wore It, 50 Iconic Fashion Moments. And you can check out more information on our website. And with that said, let me introduce our speakers very briefly. Charles Rosenberg is the author of The Trial and Execution of the Traitor George Washington and the legal thriller Death on a High Floor. Prior to turning to writing fiction and in addition to practicing law, Charles was the credited legal script consultant to 3 primetime television shows, LA Law, The Practice, and Boston Legal. And joining him tonight is Anne Kenney, a television writer, executive producer, and playwright known for her work on Switched at Birth, Outlander, and LA Law. And with that said, enjoy the talk, everyone.
Okay. Hi, Chuck.
Hi, Anne.
How are you?
I'm great. You know, I figured I met you first, I think, 30 years ago.
Oh, God, I knew you were going to say that. Don't. Oh, yeah.
You don't look any older now than you did then.
Oh, you too. We look exactly the same. We looked old then, I guess, is what it is.
I don't know.
Yeah, but it's been a long time. And our little journey through LA Law and then also the OJ trial, that was an interesting thing. So.
Yep.
And here you are. Now you've reinvented yourself as a novelist, which is pretty cool. And I have read 2 of your books. I read Death on a High Floor, right? Which was a load of fun. And then this one, which is terrific. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
So let me just jump right in with some questions. First of all, this book is what they call alternative history. You've taken history and then you've kind of come up with some twists and turns that are not didn't actually happen.
Correct.
And I guess my first question would be, when you approach something like this, it's a little bit about how you build a story. Like, do you have rules about, okay, I can twist this, but I can't twist that? How does that work for you?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Let's see. Well, first of all, what I do is I take a major event and do it differently. So, for example, in the Washington novel, he was kidnapped and taken to England to be tried for treason, which didn't happen. In this one, Lincoln loses the election of 1860, which also didn't happen. But beyond that, I try to treat the history pretty much straight up as it is, and I don't vary it much. What I do vary is who the character is interacting with, because after all, in real life, Abraham Lincoln never met the fictional characters who were in the novel.
Right.
And so I'm pretty free there to have Lincoln interact with them in a way that I create. If I'm having Lincoln interact with people who are also well known, it's a little more touchy and a little more difficult. And sometimes it might be very, very difficult. So, for example, I didn't want to write Lincoln interacting with Frederick Douglass because they're both very famous. And they never met until Lincoln was president in person, I don't believe. And so I didn't want to do that, you know.
Right.
With regard to the surround, I try very hard to go research how people spoke, what they wore, what places looked like, and do that. But sometimes I will vary what it is. For example, there's a restaurant in Chicago.
I was going to ask you about that. It sounded great.
Right.
Yeah.
Called the Versailles in my novel. I think the Versailles was an actual restaurant, I noticed, but I have no idea what the inside of the Versailles looked like.
Right.
And it's difficult to find out. So I just went and looked at a lot of restaurants from the time, and there are pictures, and sort of did them up to be fancy in the Versailles. And then I stole the menu from another restaurant. Okay. So the menu is pretty accurate, but it wasn't from the Versailles. Okay?
Right.
So those things I vary a fair amount. And things like that. It would just vary.
Right.
And so I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. And then how does you talk about research, which this would take a considerable amount of, how does that process work? I mean, for me, when I'm writing something, I'll sort of do a little research and then I'll sort of work on the story. And then once I sort of know what my story is, I can be more specific about the research that I need to do. Is that?
My process isn't terribly different than that, but in terms of Lincoln, I read my first Lincoln biography when I was in grade school. There's a set of books called the Landmark Books, which is biographies of famous people for children. And I read that. And then I've read many, many other Lincoln biographies. What I didn't know very much about before I wrote this book was the election of 1860. I decided Lincoln was going to lose. And then I said to myself, well, okay, what was the election of 1860 like?
Yeah.
For example, I didn't know that he had 3 serious opponents, not just Stephen Douglas. Okay, I think most people probably don't know that, right?
Right.
And so I spent a lot of time on that, and I finally found a manuscript, actually, not even a full book, called "Who Voted for Lincoln." Okay, that went through, and it was very surprising. For example, Lincoln lost the city of New York to Douglas.
Wow.
He only barely carried his hometown of Springfield, and he lost the county of which Springfield is the county seat. Right. So that helped a lot. And then just reading in detail about the election itself. Yeah, that was the main thrust of research about the election. And then there were a lot of other things, just Lincoln's relationship with his partner Herndon, and so on and so forth. So I've got a large stack of books.
So you started with the concept of, okay, what if he lost the election? And then you build backward and go, well, what would have made him lose the election? What situation is that kind of, so you start with that big piece and then
I started with that big piece and I figured what would make him lose the election.
Right. Okay.
And what it seemed to me is, let me tell you how this actually got started. Okay.
Okay.
I went to see my agent in New York. I'd already completed writing the Washington novel, and it was about to be published. And she said to me, well, I think there's a very, very good alternative history novel, and I bet you have another one in you. And I said, well, I don't have one in mind. And she said, she's a very direct person, Erica Silverman. She said, well, go think of one. So I came home and I said to my wife, Sally, well, I got to go think of one. Okay. So I just began, I'd always been very interested in the run up to the Civil War. There's a lot of novels about the Civil War, but not much about before it happened. So I began reading a book called 1860, and it's just about the politics of that year, which I knew very little about really. And I was reading along, and there was a footnote that said that the famous abolitionist Abby Kelly Foster was at a meeting, and I said, "Who?" Because I knew a fair amount about the abolition movement. I'd never heard of her. And when I went and looked her up, she was a radical radical abolitionist who began when she was in her 20s, being an abolitionist lecturer, where she went out and that was not a popular thing to do, even in the North. And people threw stuff at her. They threw manure at her. They threw stones. But she persevered and became a very important person. She ran a couple of abolitionist newspapers. She raised a huge amount of money for the cause. She was very involved with the American Anti-Slavery Society. And I thought, well, it would be interesting to have a novel about her, but she's not a good character for a title character because nobody knows who she is. Okay? Right. So, but I wanted to sort of tell her story. The way I did it was I moved her on a trip to Springfield, where, by the way, she never was. Talk about varying high history. And she gives a speech that causes a riot, and she's indicted for
inciting a riot.
Well, yeah, and also for violating the Fugitive Slave Act by helping somebody escape, allegedly. And so now you've got a situation where Lincoln is being asked by abolitionists, and this is really reminiscent of a lot of contemporary stuff. If you're elected president, are you going to pardon her if she's convicted?
Right.
That's a question he doesn't want to answer, because Lincoln he had a very fine line to walk. His position was, I'm not an abolitionist. Okay. I'm not going to interfere with slavery where it already exists. It's evil, but I don't want it to expand into the territories. Okay. So if he ends up saying, I'll pardon this abolitionist if she's convicted, that kind of flips the story, and people on both sides begin to get angry at him. Right.
Right.
So, that was the genesis of the whole thing, and it really generated from that. And once you've got that down, then you can sort of figure out where it all goes. And it was fun because she is a very interesting character. There are a couple of biographies of her, and her letters are a lot of her letters are on file at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Mass, and they're online to read. You don't really have to go to libraries anymore, and so I read a lot of them to get a better sense of her. And so those two characters are kind of the genesis of the novel. So
yeah, well, I love too that you have her be a follower of Sylvester Graham. Is she in fact, or did you just make?
No, she is in fact. Yeah,
that's crazy. That's nuts. My daughter went to school in Northampton, and that's where he had his headquarters or something. But yeah, the whole idea of eating graham crackers and bland food would make you passionless somehow, and that's how you would go through life.
Yeah, well, also it was supposedly better for your health, and so she was, the sort of the near equivalent of a vegan, really, and just a really interesting person. In fact, somebody should make a biopic about her. But
yeah. No, I thought that was interesting too. How really pure she is. When he offers her some apples, and it's like, well, where did they come from? And did they come from the South? And if they came from the South, well, who picked them? Because she wouldn't eat an apple that had been picked by an enslaved person. So
they came from Mary Lincoln's brother's farm.
That's what it was,
or house, and she was not happy about eating those apples. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
On the other hand, she was hungry. So
yeah. Ooh. So then to talk back about what you said about your editor said to you, well, I think you have another book in you. So was it different? I know, again, for myself, if I'm writing something that I'm just like, oh, here's something so interesting and I'm passionate about, as opposed to an assignment where you sort of find a passion about it. So how was that experience of writing this different than the George Washington book?
Oh, I think I got into it very quickly because I've always been fascinated by Abraham Lincoln. There are over 16,000 books written about Abraham Lincoln.
Wow.
And so I think the trick, if I will, to writing an alternative history is picking somebody who's well known, because then they act like a lever. People know about Washington, and they can imagine, well, if he were kidnapped, what would happen to the revolution? And they can think, well, if Lincoln is not elected, what happens?
Yeah.
So I think I got into it pretty quickly, really, particularly into it by getting more deeply into the abolition movement, which I knew about in general terms, but not in vast detail. And I learned a lot about it from writing this book. So.
And why alternative history at all? I mean, you were writing legal thrillers. What made you jump into this pool?
Partly because I'd always been fascinated by the Washington question. There was an actual plot, apparently, to kidnap Washington, which I read about many years ago, and I thought, what would have happened?
Yeah.
I've always been interested in the what if question, about how small things can affect big things. There's the old saying, for lack of a nail, the shoe was lost. For lack of a shoe, the horse was lost, goes on to the whole battle and empire being lost. And so it was that kind of fascination with the little things. Or like if you take the 2016 election, whether you like Hillary Clinton or don't like Hillary Clinton, who would have predicted that Benghazi and her mismanagement of her email would have been important factors in causing her to lose that election? And so it's that kind of thing that fascinates me. So.
Right. So I'll go off a little bit. Over the years, I've worked with a number of lawyers who are writers now, and I'm curious to know, what is it about the law that repels lawyers and wants them to do something else? And conversely, what is it about having studied law and practiced law that you think has helped or hindered you as a writer?
Well, I think what helps, obviously, each of my 6 novels now has a trial in it. Okay? And so for me, it was relatively easy to write those trials, although there are very good writers of trials who aren't lawyers. I think that on one level, it has to do with control. When you're a lawyer in a trial, you are trying desperately to control things. You're trying to control the witnesses. You're trying to get the judge to do what you want. You're trying, most importantly, to get the jury to do what you want. In a novel, it's great because the judge, well, you know this from writing television, that you can get the judge to do whatever you want.
Yep.
You can get the other side to be as moronic as you would like, right?
Yes.
If you want them to be stupid, they'll be stupid. If you want them to be smart, they'll be smart, And so I think one of the things that attracts lawyers, at least, to writing legal fiction is that finally they have control. I really do think that's true.
That's really funny. One of the things I remember about writing legal stuff was I would try to write around a question. Like if I didn't have the answer to the question, I would be like, okay, I don't want him to ask that because I don't know what to say. And eventually you just had to kind of go at it head on and say, okay, because everybody's going to be sitting there going, well, why didn't he ask that question? But yeah.
Well, I used to say to writers, and I probably said to you at one time or another, if you don't bury the problem under the rug, it makes the drama better to have the lawyer actually deal with it, or the people in the story actually deal with it. And of course, the trick is to deal with it in a way that's not so complicated that people turn the dial, or click the button or whatever they do now. So
the court scenes in here are really fun. I really, really like them.
Thank you.
Which brings me to, again, did you have any trepidation about writing Lincoln's voice? I mean, this is a super.
Yeah, no, I had a lot of trepidation about it, although not nearly so much as I had about writing Washington. Actually,
that's interesting. Why is that?
Maybe it was the first time I was a virgin for writing the voice of famous people. No, so I had some trepidation about it, but as I said earlier, there was more trepidation if I was having him deal with somebody who was well known. In having him deal with the characters who were fictional, not so much. And in the trial, the truth of the matter is there are a number of transcripts or near transcripts of Lincoln's trials, and I read some of those. But in the end, he was a lawyer. He was a great lawyer. But if you're writing a lawyer, there's a level in which over the centuries, at least in the Anglo-American system, lawyers are the same. The skill set that they need to be great lawyers is the same skill set, I think.
Interesting.
And some are better at it than others. So I simply made him into a great lawyer, which everybody says he was, and from what I can tell, he was.
Yeah.
And by the way, I have one novel that's set in the French legal system, and that was a lot more difficult, really, because I went to France and learned as much as I could about the French legal system, but that was a more difficult take. So Lincoln, the thing that I had the most trepidation about was dealing with Lincoln's humor. Okay?
Right.
Because I read a book of Lincoln's jokes, and frankly, they don't translate very well to this century. A lot of them are barnyard jokes, and they just don't work very well. Maybe when Lincoln told them in person, if he were to jump forward, they would, but they didn't on the page. And so what I did is I used a trick again. At the very beginning of the trial, as you know, the judge says to him, Mr. Lincoln, we're not going to have any of your jokes in this courtroom.
Right.
So Lincoln struggles to tell a joke throughout the whole trial. And then he did tell one joke, and it wasn't a Lincoln joke. I wrote the joke.
I was going to say, I thought that was a pretty good joke. I kind of like that. That's very funny.
I wrote that joke. So it's the only joke I've ever written, Ann. So.
It's the only one you've ever written. That's interesting.
I think, yeah.
And talking about the writing voices and stuff, at the very beginning of the book, you have an enslaved young woman, and you do tell from her point of view. And, we're in a time right now where there's a lot of conversation about cultural appropriation and who can talk for who. And how did you have any sort of reservations about that? How did you
Sure, I did. As I originally contemplated the novel, her escape was the generative event of every other story in the novel, but you didn't see it. The novel started with the riot. Okay.
Oh, wow.
And then I thought about it, and I thought, just as a matter of kind of agency, she really deserves to tell her story. Yeah. I think I would have been hesitant to write it if she were the protagonist of the novel. But as it is, it's told mostly from an omniscient narrator looking down on the situation. And so I thought that was okay to do. And it did it. So.
Yeah, well, and you and I talked about this before, but I feel like it was important to do it too, because one of the things that you talk about in here and about abolition is this sort of depersonalizing, dehumanizing of people who are enslaved. So if you had done it in the book and all she had been was this sort of, device that you moved around, it would have been less satisfying and a little like, oh, are we doing that too? So I thought that was a great choice.
Well, one of the things I thought about and learned is, it was a very courageous thing to try to escape from a plantation.
Yeah,
And of
wow.
course, Lucy is 12 years old, so it was particularly courageous for her.
Yeah,
And, I wanted to show that in some way. It's not only courageous, it's terrifying.
yeah.
And I think people think, well, the slaves escaped. But the fact is, enslaved people who decided to do that were taking a terrible, terrible risk.
Yeah.
And many of them didn't succeed, despite the stories of those who did. So.
Right. And the term enslaved people, I know, again, we're using that a lot now instead of slaves. But you have Abby using those expressions. Was that of the time also that?
Yeah, the abolitionists were among the first to argue that when you use the word slave, you've turned these people into an object. Mm-hmm. And they're not objects, they're human beings. Excuse me. And so they're enslaved human beings. So let's call them what they are.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because I think for, 150 years that didn't take in the United States. Yeah, that's what was interesting to me. Yeah. But now with a lot of movements that are going on, it has sort of returned. Yeah. And so I was very sensitive to that when I was both reading about it and writing it. So
yeah. No, that's interesting. I didn't realize that. Let's see. I'm looking at my questions. Oh, you mentioned that one of your books has been optioned for TV and film. Having worked in part of the film and TV industry, do you want to be a part of that? What's your position on that?
They've asked me, I think, if I would be willing to read the script and give notes on it, and I've said yes. But other than that, it's really a different medium. I'm not a script writer, and I really don't want to write the script, and I don't want to be too heavily involved. I'll be very interested to see what they do with it. It's the Washington novel, and we'll see what happens. So yeah. And of course, being optioned and being made, there are many slips, twixt cup and lip. So
yes, indeed, that's right. It's interesting because for me, and I love to read. I'm a big reader, a big novel reader. But the idea of all that prose, I just feel like when I'm writing a script, I'm like, if I was doing the riot, I would just want to write riot happens here. Blah, 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 blah. Not have to describe what everybody's doing and all those feel arduous to me. Do you like writing all of that?
Well, here's the truth about that. I've read, before I wrote my first novel, I'd read maybe 300 television scripts.
Right.
And they were written by really great TV writers like you and Stephen Bochco and David Kelly. And I think I learned a lot about writing dialogue, right?
Yes.
And absolutely. I didn't have that much trouble writing dialogue, which I think is the flip of many writers. I had to learn to write description, narrative description.
And, that's interesting.
And one of the things I learned early on is if you're following a character who's leaving the room, you don't have to say he got up from the desk and walked to the door and opened the door and went out. You can just say he left the room.
Right? Yes. Oh, that's true.
And of course, scripts have no stage directions to speak of.
Right.
And so I had to learn that really. So,
yeah. What's your favorite part of writing a novel?
Well, that's a great question. My favorite part of writing a novel, I think it's when it's done. No, because it takes at least a year to write a novel, at least the way I do it, not including the research. And it's when people who read, I have a lot of beta readers who I've trained to be brutally honest. The first of whom is my wife, Sally Ann. Right. She reads every chapter as it comes out of the typewriter. It's not a typewriter, obviously.
Right.
And she's very candid, and she has really great ideas. And I often revise things based on her suggestions. But what I really like is when I've given it to somebody who I think is a critical reader, and they call me up and they say, "I really like this." Okay?
Oh, it's a good feeling, isn't it? Yeah.
That to me means I've got out over the hump. And I've had people tell me, "No, this sucks."
Wow.
So.
And did they get to beta read your next book then?
They did. Yeah, they did.
Nice.
I've always appreciated the candor, and I've made some major changes sometimes based on people's reactions. So, yeah.
Wow, that's my hat's off to you. I don't like the notes. I'm looking at my questions here. So, talk a little bit, can you, about the similarities? What did the similarities in what was happening in 1860 compare to the political divisiveness now? Like, how do those things, how did that affect you writing this? And can you look at the crystal ball and tell us what's going to happen?
Well, I think it was similar. although the bitterness, although I think a difference is, and there are people who no doubt would disagree with me, is that there was no solution in 1860. Okay, I don't see how the states that favored slavery and the states that didn't could have really gone on in one union without some cataclysmic event. There are people who violently disagree with that, who say no, Lincoln didn't have to do the Civil War and so forth. But today I think, or I hope, that there are solutions to the disagreements and the bitterness. Of course, when I say it worked out then, well, it worked out in a civil war that killed more than 600,000 people in a country of only 30 million. So maybe you could say it worked out, maybe it didn't.
Right.
And we're still dealing with some of the issues that were being dealt with then. So.
And how does writing the alternative history compare with writing a legal thriller?
It's harder. It's harder because in a legal thriller, for the most part, you make it all up. Because I don't have to go study what the law is in a legal thriller. I pretty much know it, or if I do, it's a rather minor thing. Right. But in this, it's much harder. For example, in the Lincoln novel, I wanted the 19th century courtroom procedure to be accurate. And I have a very close friend, Daniel Wershaw, who is a retired lawyer in Seattle. We went to college together. And I asked Daniel if he would go research some of the jurisdictional issues, and he did. And he did a great job. And so I didn't have to do that. So I sort of, sent that out. Basically.
Yeah.
So it's a lot harder because you're also, when I write my legal thrillers, they're in my own time. Right. I don't have to think about what did people wear in a courtroom. I don't have to think about any of that stuff. It's like one of the things I've thought is, if I'm writing something set in 1860 or 1780, if I could just go back there for a week and look around and talk to people, it would be great. So let me give you an example. In the 1780s, men wore these really heavy coats, right? And there was no air conditioning, and the windows were often closed. And I thought, well, did they take them off and hang them over the back of a chair, or not? And the answer is no. Apparently, they didn't.
Wow.
So they just sweated a lot.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I thought it was interesting. One of the things in here too was the idea, and I think it's changed now, that at that time a defendant could not testify and then be cross-examined.
Right. A defendant could not testify in his or her own defense. Right. And it was thought that one reason was they were likely to lie if they did that.
Right.
And since they were under oath, they took oaths very seriously, and you go to hell if you lied under oath. They didn't want to put people to that. And there were some other reasons. And that was true in England as well. And it didn't change. It began to change in the 1860s. That was one of the rules. So, but you were allowed to make a statement if you wanted to that wasn't under oath. You could tell the jury, here's my story. And then the judge would admonish them, now this person isn't under oath, so this could all be totally made up. You can give it what weight you will.
Right.
And some defendants chose to do that. And even today, there's a question of should you testify, should you not testify.
Right.
People generally in most criminal trials, particularly ones for murder, rape, robbery, etc., don't testify. Whereas on television they do.
Right, right. And why don't they testify?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons. One, their stories probably won't hold up very well under cross-examination. After all, there are other witnesses to say the opposite. Also, I think the lore among criminal defense lawyers, and I've never done the criminal trials I've been involved in have been white-collar federal, which is very different. But the lore is, if you let the person testify and the jury convicts them anyway, an appellate court isn't going to be very interested in the errors that might have been made in the trial because the jury listened directly to the person and didn't believe them.
Yeah, yeah.
So it sort of washes over everything. So.
That's so interesting. But they ultimately did change it. I mean, is there any place now that still has that rule? Do you know?
I don't believe there's any state that has that rule.
Yeah.
And I don't believe England has that rule. Beyond that, I couldn't say.
Yeah. So what's up next?
I've actually wanted to write something about Robert E. Lee, but nobody's enthusiastic about it in today's climate.
Yeah,
and actually, I've seriously been thinking of writing a science fiction novel.
Oh.
I've had one around as an idea. I wrote the preface like 20 some years ago,
Right.
and I wrote the first chapter. And it might be fun to do that. It's set 1,000 years in the future. And I have some very good friends who are prominent astronomers who can help me, or astrophysicists, with some of the science I need.
Right.
And other than that, I wouldn't have to do a lot of research. So,
That's true. You could just make stuff up. Will it be a dystopian? Is it a dystopian world?
It's maybe quasi-dystopian.
Right.
It actually is based in some degree on what it was like to emigrate from Europe to North America as a European in the 17th century, where you were leaving behind everyone you knew and you were unlikely ever to see them again. So.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, because most science fiction is sort of a little bit of a metaphor. You know what I mean? So that's very cool. That's very cool. So I don't know. I think.
Do you want to be a beta reader, Anne?
Sure, I'll be a beta reader.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely. But
you're on the list.
Yeah, okay, but yeah, my husband's my beta reader, and he's very brave because I do not like notes. And when you get them from, I don't know about your editor, but certainly from like the executives, I can't go, no, that sucks. But I can't.
Well, you didn't dislike the notes I gave you, did you?
No, I didn't dislike them because your notes would be coming from a sort of expert point of view, and you'd be talking about the legal stuff and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Plus, you were always a great technical advisor. Again, we've talked about this before. The best technical advisor is the person that you can go to and say, here's the story I'm telling. Here's what I need to have happen. Is there any way this can happen? And that you were always very game to do that, as opposed to the technical advisor that would never happen.
Yeah, like what are you trying to accomplish dramatically? I used to tell some writers, and that would never happen in a real courtroom, but we'll work with it anyway. And then it would go on the air, and some lawyer would come up to me at a meeting and say, that thing that happened to me in a courtroom.
No kidding. Oh, that's so interesting. Well, go ahead.
There are thousands of courtrooms and hundreds of nuts judges. And so many good judges, but there are some who are off the wall. And so, of course, many strange things happen.
Absolutely. Well, again, that's always the question on my side that we ask is, okay, could this ever happen? And if the person says, well, yeah, then you're like, okay, I can do it.
You can do it,
yeah.
Or you remember, we used to hang a flag on things. We would say, find a way to tell the audience this is very, very unusual, and that way communicate that this is unusual. But we call it hanging a flag on it. So
yes.
And sometimes I've hung a flag on things in my own novels. So
that's all right. That gives you the leeway. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So.
Well, should we take some questions? Do you want?
Yeah, we can open it up to questions. I know that we have a couple here. If you could just open up the Ask a Question tab, you should be able to see them.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, Chuck, you pick.
Well, let's see. I guess maybe we'll pick the one at the top.
Okay.
You said you already knew a lot about Lincoln going into this project, but what's the thing about Lincoln and his life that you were the most surprised or delighted to learn? Well, I think one thing was what I said earlier, that he wasn't kind of uniformly popular even in the North. I think going into this, I assumed that he just was a smash success in the North. And he did win in reality, unlike in the novel. He did win every state by a majority of the vote, but he only got 40% of the popular vote nationwide, just under 40%. Wow. And so I think that was probably the most surprising thing, was his lack of the fact that he was far from a majority president. So
Interesting. Okay, let's try another one here. Okay. But do you have a favorite or a least favorite president?
Oh, I'd say that my least favorite president is Buchanan, who preceded Lincoln. And he is in the novel, shown in a rather negative light, I think he's least favorite because it's possible that had Buchanan been more adept, he might have actually avoided the Civil War. Despite my having said earlier, I thought it was kind of inevitable, maybe.
Yeah.
So he was a Northerner from Pennsylvania who was effectively pro-slavery, even though he denied it. And when the South seceded, or the Southern states seceded, or about to, he said, it's unconstitutional for them to do that, but under the Constitution, I have no power to do anything about it. So He was a wimp, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So
I thought it was interesting in the book too, and I was curious to ask you about that. If that was a real thing, was all of his kind of, back seat or back, back whatever it is, room machinations, where he was trying to manipulate things to so that Lincoln didn't get elected. Is that just something you made up, or was that actually going on?
Well, he certainly and others in his party wanted Lincoln not to be elected, and they did all kinds of things politically to try to prevent that. But I made up the particular plot that he engaged in to try to get Lincoln not elected. I just made that up out of whole cloth. Okay. But the person who's in it, Jeremiah Black, his attorney general, was a real person. Mm-hmm. I read some of his speeches and papers. And so I think the interaction between them, Black's position as stated in the novel was his actual position about secession. Mm-hmm. So forth. So
interesting. All right, let's go back to our questions. What do you got here? How did you come up with Lucy's name?
I just picked it out of the air. Mm-hmm. I wanted a name that wasn't the name of a well-known enslaved person. There are a fair number of those. Mm-hmm. It's sort of the question of how do I come up with names for characters? And I don't really know the answer to that. I just kind of pick them out. And if I'm dealing in modern times, I try to look to see whether anyone has that name by using various internet tools. And I either want somebody where nobody has that name,
right,
or lots of people have that name.
Right.
Like if I picked, Mary Jones, there are a million Mary Joneses,
right,
so it wouldn't be a problem. But I just don't want to be accused of there are a couple of people in the novel, by the way, who are named for friends. Okay?
Right.
So, and so anyway.
It's funny. I have friends who they start with a name, like they have to have the name of the character before they can write it. And for me, that's another one that I'm like, oh, and what I do is I just look through the books in my office and just pick names. So maybe there'll be a Chuck in my next script. Or Charles, actually, as you are in your book.
Yeah.
Coming up with names, or else I find I suddenly have everybody's last name all starts with an H, or starts. I get in a kind of a role with people. Names are tricky.
I've had editors tell me that I should change someone's name because it was too off-putting. Whatever. And I made up a name for someone once. I've forgotten what it was. It was a very unusual, bizarre name. Mm-hmm. And I thought nobody could possibly have this name. And when I looked, someone did. And
wow.
I was just astounded. What, really? So
how does that work? Actually, you're talking about your editors. Again, you've been privy to notes from studio and network executives and that kind of thing. How does it? Do you get notes? Do you have to take the notes? Do you how does that work?
I get notes. I mean, there are three levels of notes. Okay. The editor, who is mm-hmm. not a line editor, but the person in this case, Peter Joseph, who purchased the novel for the publisher, and he read the first several drafts and gave me suggestions and notes. And I think in most cases his notes were excellent, and I think I adopted almost everything he said. He was like mm-hmm. the ultimate beta reader, if you will.
Right. Yeah.
And then it goes through a copy edit,
right,
and through a proofread. And in the copy edit, it's always been my understanding that I was free to do what the copy editor suggested or not.
Okay.
And I suppose I don't really know what would happen if I just blew everything off and said, no, I'm not doing any of that. I think people would be unhappy. But for the most part, I've been really lucky to have good editors and good copy editors and good proofreaders. And so it's been kind of a seamless, non-painless process.
Right, basically. Right. And you are very much, with a novel, you are the author. It's not like, again, in television when you have, let's all break it in the room and and then you're writing it for this one and they rewrite it and that kind of thing. None of that goes on. You're in control of it, basically.
Right. Or in the ultimate horror story where you're a writer of a movie.
Right? Yes. That sounds really bad. Yeah. Where somebody compared it to you're the booster rocket. You just get it into space and then they want you to go away.
There was a scene in the modern Hong Kong movie, not Hong Kong, King Kong movie, mm-hmm. Where the writer's writing it as they're filming it, and the writer comes up on deck and with a chapter, and they mm-hmm. say, "Please move aside. We're doing something important here." Sort of an inside joke.
Yes, indeed, I can relate to that. Absolutely.
So I've been lucky in the process, really.
That's great. That's really good. And have you had the same editor for all of your books?
No, but Peter has been the editor for both the Washington book and the Lincoln book. I had a couple different editors for the early ones, and they were all good. I don't have any complaints about any of them. So,
and Chuck, one of the things I really admire about you is you really did reinvent yourself. I mean, is there anything you can say to people who say, I want to be a novelist? Because you wrote your first book, and man, you really went out there and you believed in it and you promoted it. And what would you tell people?
Be careful your hobbies don't get out of control. I think it's possible to do, and I think that the thing you can say about writing a novel is, and I'm quoting here another writer whose name I'm not coming up with at the moment, that anyone can write a novel. All you have to do is do it. And that's because the form is well known. I mean, most people have read hundreds of novels, at least people want to write one. And so you know how it works. And it doesn't mean that it'll be any good necessarily.
Right.
But, so I'd say the advice I'd say is just go write one. Come up with a plot, come up with some characters, and then show it to people and see if they think it's any good. And maybe they will. And if not, ask them to be very candid about what's wrong with it and write another. And I'd say that's my advice about it. And keep at it. That sounds kind of.
Well, I mean, there's no magical formula. And do you think the internet and all that makes it easier for people? Does it give more access to people to get out there and get their stuff read, not just by their friends? Is there, like with self-publishing and that kind of thing?
I think yes and no. I think it is easier on the level you just described, but it's harder because there are now many, many more books.
Yeah.
Because self-publishing has allowed, and Amazon and Barnes & Noble and other people have allowed a lot more books to be published.
Right.
And so there's more competition, basically. So it's good and bad, I think. But it's also a fun process. I should tell you, I started a novel in the 70s that I never finished.
Wow.
And when I started Death on a High Floor, Sally Ann said to me, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm writing a novel." And she said, "Are you going to finish this one?"
Oh, funny.
And I said, "Oh, is there some downsides to long-term relationships?"
Would you ever go back and finish that one?
No, although I still have the manuscript.
But you would never go back and finish it?
I don't know. It's called Drill Here, She Said. It's got an interesting title.
That's
yeah,
wow.
It's about oil, but
okay.
But anyway, yeah, I mean, it has good characters. I haven't looked at it in years, but yeah, I can imagine finishing it, maybe. So I'd have to try to remember the plot.
Yeah. Well, maybe you'd come up with something even better now.
That's true. So
okay, I'm going to go back to our questions. Do you use an outline? Do you use a beat sheet? And somebody wants to know what's your daily life like when you are writing.
Well, the answer is the publisher, my agent, makes me do a proposal.
Okay.
And the proposal is not as detailed as an outline, but it does outline who the characters are and what happens in general terms. I don't always follow that outline. I don't necessarily even look at it again. Okay, I just write the novel. And in fact, there was one novel I wrote in which a major character appeared in the first scene because I needed somebody to flesh out a dinner party. There needed to be another person.
Right.
And she became a major player in the novel. Okay? And my daily life, I know a lot of writers have set schedules. They write, in the morning. I'm still practicing law. And at a reduced level, and I've got a lot of other things going on. So I write when I find the time to write. And the truth is, I usually have a deadline by which I've promised the publisher a manuscript. And as I get closer to the deadline, I spend more and more time at it. So that's kind of my process. It might be better if I had a regular time to write. But
I can't imagine that would be. So how do days go by when you don't work on it?
Sometimes, yeah. And also sometimes it's good to let days go by because you can come back to a chapter you wrote and you can read it and say, oh, this really does suck, and so I've got to rewrite it. Whereas maybe you wouldn't do that if you just moved on. And one other thing I'd say is people talk about drafts. I don't really have multiple drafts. I write the novel and then I go back and modify it. I modify this chapter, I modify that chapter. So there's really just a single flow. and I save it each day so I can see what I had at that particular day.
Yeah.
But I don't have draft 1, draft 2, draft 3. So.
And you write front to back. You don't like say, oh, here's a scene. Like I love those courtroom scenes, so I'm just going to write those first, and then I'll go over here and write this one, and then I'll write that.
Generally not. There are a few scenes I've written in novels sort of out of order, but generally I don't. So.
Yeah, again, Diana Gabaldon she does just the opposite, which I don't understand because I'm a big front to back. I like to start here and go here, and she's just. And I know other people who are television writers who do that too. Oh, I think this scene sounds interesting, that sounds interesting, and then they kind of cobble them all together.
Yeah. How many Outlander novels has she written?
She's writing the 10th now. She's written 9, and then she's written all kinds of spin-off. She has the whole Lord John Grey series, and then she's written novellas. She's incredibly prolific.
Well, my first novel, Death on a High Floor, involves a lawyer in his 60s named Robert. And I've thought about writing a prequel called Young Robert.
That's fun.
About Robert when he first started practicing law when he was in his mid-20s. But beside having thought about that, I've done nothing about it.
Okay. I'm going to go to the questions again. Somebody wants to know what the name of Lincoln's dog was.
Fido.
Fido does not make an appearance in the book, does he?
No, and that's because, to be candid, I didn't know about Fido when I wrote the book. And I learned about Fido because I went to a virtual brown bag lunch at the Lincoln Museum and Library in Springfield, which, by the way, is a fabulous museum. If you ever get to Springfield, it's the best museum about an individual I've ever been to.
Oh, wow.
It's only 15 years old, and they've done a very great job of merging technology and traditional things. It's just really quite an emotional experience, actually. But I went to a brown bag lunch, and somebody in the audience asked the historian, did the Lincolns have any pets? And he said, yeah, they had a dog named Fido in Springfield who they didn't take with him to Washington. And I'd never heard of Fido, despite having read all this stuff about the Lincolns and their personal life. And I was kind of annoyed because Fido would certainly have been in the novel. And they also had 2 cats in the White House, one of whom was named Dixie.
Oh, that's funny. Did you ever think about dipping more into his personal life? Was that ever in your mind?
No, not really. For one thing, that's been worked a lot, and I think it's really nonfiction for the most part. Mary Lincoln makes a brief cameo appearance in the novel, but that's it. I mean, she was a very interesting person in her own right, and I think has been treated poorly by historians in a lot of ways. But no, I've never thought about doing that. That's a wholly different sort of thing, I think.
But you
and
did,
not what interests me.
I was going to say, you did dip your toe into romance in this one, though. So maybe you'll write something romantic.
I did, and frankly, that was Peter Joseph's suggestion. He read an early draft, and he said, "These people seem like they're attracted to each other." And I said to myself and to my wife, "Oh well, the idea that 2 people who hate one another fall in love is certainly original. So why don't I do that?"
Yeah.
So
that was interesting to me in the novel that the Pinkertons, and apparently that's true, that the Pinkerton that he did in fact hire women as detectives.
He did, and in fact, there's a very famous Pinkerton detective in the 1850s named Kate Warney. And I actually didn't know about Kate Warney when I wrote my character. I knew he had hired, for some reason I just missed her, and then I read about her later. And what's interesting is she had many characteristics that my character has. And it may be that just the times sort of created a woman who would do that with those characteristics. Because, again, it took a certain amount of chutzpah to go out and be a woman detective in the 1850s.
Yeah, wow.
So.
It sounds like, now you said you hadn't heard about that before you wrote this, and then you were also at the museum after you'd written this about Fido. Did you continue to do research after you wrote the book?
No. I have a continuing interest in Lincoln, and I really like that museum. And so they have these brown bag lunches, if you're a member, and I went to some of them. So hear some of the Lincoln historians talk. So
So if you write if you were writing a contemporary novel now, would you incorporate what's happening to us? Would you have? That's a conversation that, again, in my business, we've had a lot of conversations about. If your story happens today, Do you have people in masks? Do you deal with the pandemic? Do you not deal with it?
Well, here's the partial answer to that. I have a partially finished novel. It's about 70,000 words written that I wrote maybe 8 or 9 years ago. It's called An Inconvenient Body. And it's about a dead, naked woman found in the Oval Office not long after the president's left the room.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote it years before the current political situation of the current president. And I looked at it recently. Some people have said to me, you really ought to finish it because it probably wouldn't take much to do. And I've noticed that I have to update all the technology in it because even though it was only 10 years ago, there's no texting, for example.
Right.
There's no social media to speak of. I don't think there was even Facebook in it. There's emails, right?
Right.
And people don't use their cell phones in the same way they do now. There's an opening scene in which the First Lady answers the phone from her nightstand. And I have to rewrite that so she looks at it and wonders who could possibly be calling on a landline.
Right.
So,
it's crazy. Yeah, that certainly just the amount of time that I've been doing this has been a big change. And sometimes I was thinking about that even with your novel. There's an advantage to, like, you know, you can't just, you go here and then you just pick up your phone and tell somebody. You have to go back and talk to them. You know what I mean? That there's not that immediacy. And I know when I was first writing, and would write like a cop type thing or lawyers, you couldn't just, somebody could just call you. So that was helpful sometimes in telling stories because you could keep people apart in a way that you can't now.
Right. Well, yeah, it's like in Lincoln's time, there was at least the telegraph and a relatively efficient mail system.
Mm-hmm.
But in Washington's time, if something happened here and you wanted to find out about it in England, you had to wait for the ship to cross the Atlantic, which going that direction could take 6 weeks. I mean, Lord North, who was the prime minister, didn't find out about the loss at the Battle of Yorktown until many, many weeks later. He was at a dinner party when somebody handed him a note. You know, it's probably spoiled his dinner. So yeah, the time and in the Washington novel in particular, how long it took people to get places was just, the roads were terrible, you know, and even in London they were not so good. And so that was, it took me a long time to wrap my head around the fact that you had to take account of the fact that there was no instantaneous communication. Period.
Yeah, that would be it would be very strange. You would really have to just shift your head around completely.
Yeah, it took some shifting of my head. So,
do you ever think, gee, here's a place I'd like to go. Let me write a book that I could go there. You mentioned going to France and doing research. I mean, not right now, you can't, but you know, eventually, hopefully, we'll all be able to travel again. Does that ever enter into your decision-making process?
Oh yeah, I mean, I went to France to write that novel, and it's called Paris Ransom. But yeah, I mean, although there's a scene in one novel which is in a city of Spain that I'd never been to, and I only conceived the idea of having a scene there when it was too late to go in terms of the writing process.
Right.
So I wrote it based on using Google Street View and reading a lot of tourist brochures and a lot of other things. And I was so pleased. One of the reader reviews said, you know, I've lived in that city, and he really nailed it.
Isn't that funny?
I thought really if you only knew.
Yeah. So. Well, again, Diana's famous for when she wrote Outlander, she'd never been to Scotland.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Now she's been a lot, I would assume.
Yes, I'm sure she has.
And how long did you spend in Scotland?
I was there a total of probably about 6 months, something like that, over the 3 episodes or 3 seasons.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's fun. Hello, where are you back?
Yes, we have about a minute left. If you have any last comments, now's the time to do it.
Go for it.
A lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun, and Anne's questions have been excellent, and they make me realize that it is fun to write novels, even though at times it's a sloggy process. But, there's a lot of fun in it. And Anne, how many scripts have you written?
Oh my God, I couldn't. Probably hundreds at this point. Yeah. So. But I still really enjoy the process. It's really fun. You know, I'm sure you probably experienced too. You sort of. I dread getting to the computer, and then once I'm there, suddenly hours go by, and you go, "Oh, that's."
It's like when I start a novel, I type the first few paragraphs and I think to myself, a year from now, there's actually going to be a full novel in this space,
Yes.
but I don't know exactly how it's going to happen.
Yes. Yeah. And the more you do, the more I think you're confident that is going to happen. And when those first few, you just think, oh my God, this will never happen, but you do get it done. So.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So.
And my last comment would be, this is an excellent book and everyone should read it. It's really fun. It's like this great combo of escapism, but it has enough political stuff that you sort of feel like you're in the world still. And it was really fun.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations. Yeah.
Thanks.
This was a really fun conversation as well. And thank you so much for the wonderful conversation. And to everyone who was in the chat and who were active, and to everyone who asked such thoughtful questions. Again, if you're considering purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book, just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer screen. Also, a replay of this talk will be available within an hour, just using the same stream link. So if you have any friends who missed a talk tonight, just send them the link and they'll be able to rewatch it. And also, if you would like more updates on upcoming virtual events, just check out our website. We have a calendar and you can keep track of what's going to come up next. And I think that's about it. Stay safe, everyone, and have a good evening.
You too. Thank you. Thanks for asking me, Chuck. It was really fun.
You're welcome. Thanks for doing it. And Good night, everybody.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.